The rain started as a fine mist that turned the city into a watercolor, and somewhere between a red light and the hollow buzz of my phone, I saw my wife laughing with a man at the corner cafe, as if time had politely stepped aside for them both. Her text still glowed on my screen. "Working late, don't wait up." A clean sentence with no loose ends, while across the street the cafe windows were fogged with warmth and the kind of easy familiarity that doesn't come from spreadsheets. I eased the car into a space by a hydrant, the wipers ticking like a metronome for a song I didn't remember choosing, and for a full breath I told myself it was a work thing, a casual debrief, nothing to hold against the soft cream sweater she wore when she wanted to feel like herself. Inside, she leaned forward, elbows on the small round table, hands around a mug that gathered the light. Opposite her, a man I recognized from a holiday party, Evan, the quiet one from her team, tilted his head in that listening way that makes words spill easier. A barista crossed their line of sight with a tray of cups, and in that half second I prayed the scene would rearrange into innocence when the tray passed. But when it did, their eyes were still tethered, a gentle thread pulled taut over steam and cinnamon. I told myself to breathe, and my breath fogged the windshield until the world turned to a blur. So I wiped a circle clear with the back of my hand, like a child pressing his face to a museum case, watching a history he has no permission to touch. Her smile wasn't a public smile, not the careful, courteous curve she wore at weddings and neighborhood barbecues. This one rose slow and true, the sort that begins behind the ribs and only later remembers to visit the mouth. Every small motion became a confession. The way she tucked a strand of hair, the way he reached but stopped an inch short, the way both glanced down together as if sharing the same invisible page. And I felt something in me grow quiet and cold. A bus hissed by and threw up water that rattled my door, and I flinched, the spell cracking, then knitting back as the bell over the cafe door chimed, and a couple hurried in, shaking rain from their coats, ordinary life moving like a backdrop to my private earthquake. I remember the first time I took Sarah for coffee, the same kind of rain, the same amber light, how she'd traced a circle on the table with a teaspoon and said, "I like the city best when it behaves like a secret." And I wondered when my part of her secret had ended. On the table between them lay a folder, thin, harmless, and a pen placed perfectly parallel to the edge, the kind of neatness that pretends to be business, though no one stares like that at a quarterly report. I cracked the window to listen, but the rain kept its own counsel. Soft applause on metal and glass. A few words escaped. Timing, wasn't planning, felt right. Each one a door in a hallway I couldn't bring myself to walk. My hands found the steering wheel and tightened until leather creaked, a small animal noise, and I noticed the tremor in my knuckles, the way adrenaline sets up camp quietly and unpacks where it pleases. He laughed at something she said, a careful laugh, low and warm, and she ducked her head like she does when praise is close enough to touch. I felt jealous of a sound, an absurd thing to envy, but jealousy rarely asks permission to be reasonable. A memory intruded. Last week, late evening, a faint scent of a new cologne on her scarf. I'd asked, "New client?" And she'd answered too quickly, "Office elevator." And I'd believed her because trust is easier than the inventory of doubt. The bell chimed again, and a draft lifted the corner of a napkin on their table. Evan pressed it down with two fingers, and for a heartbeat she placed her hand over his, as if thanking him, as if confirming something both of them were already pretending not to know. My throat went dry, heat rising despite the cold in the car, and a dozen versions of me staged rehearsals in my head. Me barging in, me waving politely, me calling her phone and watching her face change. But none of the rehearsals survived the first line. She took out her phone, glanced at the screen, and then, with a small frown I knew too well, turned it face down like one tucks away a secret. I checked mine, hoping for a message that would rewind the evening, but all I had was her earlier sentence, tidy as a lie. The cafe lights painted watery coins on the pavement, and in each trembling circle I could see their reflections. Two figures leaning toward each other like parentheses, closing around a quiet, unsaid thing. A group of students burst into laughter somewhere down the block, a bright sound that didn't belong to this narrow, suspended world. Inside, the laughter at their table was small and private, a candle compared to the students' sparkler, but the candle was the only flame I felt. A server placed a second dessert between them, spoons crossed like little swords, and they stirred the same corner of a slice without eating it, as though the ritual mattered more than the sweetness, as though it was the excuse they needed to linger 10 more minutes. I pictured our kitchen at home, the wooden bowl with tonight's chopped salad waiting under plastic wrap, the garlic I'd minced too finely because she likes it that way, and the silent clock that would mark the moment she wasn't coming back for dinner. What if it's innocent? I thought. And immediately the thought tripped over the truth that innocence rarely arrives disguised as midnight coffee in a sweater she keeps for soft days. Innocence is bold in daylight, not this quiet whisper behind glass. My phone buzzed again, not from her, but from the group chat with coworkers sharing memes and weather complaints. I stared at the stupid blinking dots and wished conversation were as simple as sending a small joke to be received without fear. In a brief lull of rain, the sounds sharpened. The scrape of chair legs, the squeak of rubber soles, the soft click of a bracelet as she tucked her wrist beneath her chin, and I realized how much of a person you can recognize by their music alone. He slid the folder toward her and tapped a line. She said, "Are you sure?" And he nodded after a heartbeat too long. The pause that tells you yes means about more than the ink on paper, and I swallowed hard because I understood sentences without hearing them. Headlights swept across the window, and for an instant my face appeared faintly in the glass, superimposed over theirs, like a ghost peering into a room he used to own. I looked older in that reflection, as if grief had already done its quiet arithmetic. I reached for the door handle, stopped, reached again, and stopped once more. Every movement a small referendum on courage. And in that hesitation I understood why some people stay in burning houses long enough to gather photographs. When she laughed again, she covered her mouth with one hand, a habit she learned in college, modest and charming. He leaned in, eyes alive with the thrill of a shared joke, and something in me started counting seconds like a diver measuring oxygen. I remembered the vows we wrote, how she'd said, "I promise to make room for your silences," and how I'd promised to keep her dreams fed. I wondered if this was a dream I had forgotten to feed, whether hungry things go looking for any open door. The barista dimmed the lights a notch, closing time easing into the room like a gentler weather, and people began to drift toward the door, umbrellas blooming outside like dark flowers opening to drink the night. They didn't move, not yet, stretching the last minutes like a sheet trying to cover too much. Evan said something that made her eyes shine with a complicated brightness, and she nodded slowly, the kind of nod that agrees with emotions before logistics. Rain returned in thicker strokes, a painter switching to a braver brush, and the window turned to a slow-moving mirror. Through it, I saw him stand, slide on his jacket, and hover, unsure if he should reach for her hand the way a cliff wonders if it should call the tide. She gathered her bag, smoothed the sweater, and looked toward the door, but not at the door, as if aligning her courage with the night. Then she lifted her mug for one last sip and left a crescent of lipstick like a signature that wasn't mine to read. They walked together toward the exit, and he reached to hold the door, courtesy performing the role desire is not allowed to play. She stepped beneath his arm, almost close enough to brush, and the bell chimed a small metallic blessing. I ducked lower, absurdly, as if truth could be fooled by posture. Watching them pause at the awning where rain made a beaded curtain, he said something short, she answered even shorter, and the shortness between them felt full, not empty. They parted with a look that agreed upon later, the kind of look you can only see if you know what later costs. And then she turned up her collar and began walking in the direction that would take her past my car, past the version of me that had left the porch light on. My heart hammered, loud enough to feel in my teeth, and every plan I'd rehearsed dissolved into fog. I didn't start the engine, didn't call her name, just watched her approach, each step a metronome counting down to a conversation I no longer knew how to begin. As she neared, her face lifted slightly to meet the rain, the way she does when she wants to feel something honest. For a second, I hoped the night would wash her clean of whatever this was, that she'd see me by accident and choose the old story. She passed within 20 feet, eyes forward, not searching, and I understood that the most painful part of coincidence is its refusal to disguise itself as fate. She kept walking, and the smell of her perfume drifted into the car like a memory that didn't ask permission. When she turned the corner, I let the breath out that I'd been storing like contraband, and in the spent quiet I finally heard the small fact that had been knocking the whole time. Trust doesn't shatter, it frays, and by the time you notice the thread in your hand, the garment has already learned a new shape. I started the engine, the dashboard lights rising like a slow dawn, and in the rear view the cafe shrank into a rectangle of honeyed light, a theater where the curtain had fallen without applause. I pulled away, carrying home the rain, the silence, and a question that would not sleep beside me. That night, the house met me with the smell of garlic and the hush of a room that had practiced being alone. I set two plates side by side anyway, a ritual for ghosts, then turned off the kitchen light and waited for the sound of her key, as if waiting could change what I had seen. And while I waited, hands flat on the cool counter, I made a small, reckless promise to myself. Tomorrow I would ask for the truth. Not the tidy version with clean edges, but the version with rain on it, the version that looks you in the eyes and doesn't blink. When the key finally turned, it sounded like a stranger knocking politely on my life. I stood very still and understood that the door I was about to open led both back into our home and forward into whatever waited at the far edge of our next sentence. Sarah stepped inside with the sound of rain following her, droplets clinging to her hair like small truths reluctant to fall, the scent of the wet street trailing behind her like an invisible coat. She shut the door gently, almost too gently, as if avoiding the sound of arrival could somehow disguise the lateness of it. Her eyes flicked toward me for less than a second before retreating to the floorboards. She hung her coat on the hook by the entryway, taking her time, smoothing the fabric as though every wrinkle demanded a private conversation between them. I stood in the kitchen doorway, watching the careful choreography. On the table, two plates sat side by side, the salad untouched, its greens beginning to wilt under plastic wrap. She noticed them and smiled faintly, polite, shallow, the kind of smile you'd offer a stranger in an elevator. "You're still up?" she said, her voice steady, like this was a normal exchange at a normal hour, as though I hadn't been waiting in a dim kitchen listening for the key in the lock. "I couldn't sleep," I answered, keeping my tone level, though my chest still carried the weight of what I'd seen through that cafe window. She stepped closer, loosening the scarf from her neck, placing it over the back of a chair in a slow, precise motion. "You didn't have to wait. I told you I'd be late." The words were soft, but the rhythm felt rehearsed. "Was it work?" I asked, letting the question float in the air, my gaze resting on her face for any tremor, any flicker of hesitation. She nodded too quickly. "Evan and I were going over campaign ideas. The deadline's close." The sentence came wrapped in calm, but it was the calm of something already prepared. The name sat between us like a coin on the table. Evan. I thought of the shared dessert, the way they leaned in, the napkin pressed under his fingers. I thought of her sweater, chosen for comfort, not corporate hours. I walked past her to the counter, poured two glasses of water. Placing one in front of her felt like setting down an anchor neither of us wanted to claim. She murmured, "Thank," without lifting her eyes, and we began eating in a quiet that wasn't quite peace. Our conversation stayed on the surface, like two people swimming above a deep current they'd rather not acknowledge. She talked about edits, budgets, client feedback. I nodded in all the right places. The faint scent of cinnamon and vanilla drifted from her sleeve when she reached for the bread. I knew that aroma. It belonged to the cafe's signature dessert. My fork slowed, my appetite shrinking with every breath of it. I found myself memorizing small details. The way she shifted in her chair, the way she tapped her thumb lightly on the water glass. Every movement was a note, part of a song I was learning by heart without wanting to. When she mentioned the long brainstorming session, I pictured the amber light of the booth, the steam rising between them, the quiet laugh that had curved her shoulders toward him. Dinner ended with her gathering the plates. She stood at the sink, turning on the water. The stream's steady rush filled the room, a shield against whatever words might have been brave enough to cross the space between us. I stood behind her, close enough to see the damp ends of her hair darkening her sweater, close enough to sense her warmth in the cool kitchen air, yet somehow miles away from reaching out. "Long day," she said, almost to herself, her voice blurred by the sound of water on porcelain. "Yeah," I said quietly. "Long night, too." The words felt heavier than they should have, as though I'd smuggled an entire unspoken story inside them. For a fraction of a second, her hands paused in the sink. The plates shifted under the stream, a tiny accidental clink. Then her rhythm returned, smooth as if nothing had interrupted it. Later in the bedroom, she turned onto her side quickly, back facing me, like someone closing a book before you can finish the page. The blanket rose and fell with her breathing, even and untroubled. I lay staring at the ceiling, tracing invisible lines from one shadow to the next, trying to map out where suspicion ends and certainty begins. The room felt too quiet, as though even the air was waiting for me to ask the question I'd avoided. In the darkness, I replayed the cafe scene again. The laugh, the lean, the way she'd turned her phone face down like one tucks away a secret. My mind stitched the images into a loop, and each time it played, the gap between us widened a little more. Sleep didn't come. Instead, I kept hearing the cafe door chime, seeing the way she'd stepped under his arm, almost close enough to brush. And somewhere in the slow ache of the night, I began to wonder not just what had happened, but when it had begun. Evening slid into the apartment like a careful guest, bringing with it the smell of rain drying on concrete and the low hum of the city's night shift beginning. Sarah's key turned in the lock, softer this time, as if the door itself might judge her arrival. She stepped in, coat draped over her arm, hair slightly disheveled from the wind. I was already sitting at the table, 2 mugs of tea cooling between us, steam fading in small sighs. The plant I'd bought earlier sat on the windowsill, leaves catching the amber streetlight. She noticed it. "New plant?" she asked, voice testing the air like someone checking the water before diving in. "Yeah," I said. "It's supposed to last if you take care of it." The words were heavier than the ceramic pot that held them. She looked at me then, really looked, as if seeing the outline of a man she'd known but hadn't studied in a while. "We need to talk," she said, and my chest tightened at the absence of a softener like maybe or later. I nodded. "We do." My voice was steady, but my hands curled into fists beneath the table, gripping the edge as though the wood could anchor me. She sat opposite, folding her coat neatly in her lap, a small act of control in a conversation where control would be scarce. "I don't want to hurt you," she began, which everyone knows is the prelude to something that will do exactly that. I kept my gaze on her face, watching for the flickers between words, the pauses where truth lives. "Then be honest, all the way." Her shoulders rose and fell in a slow exhale. "Evan, he's not, it's not what you think." "That's the second time you've said that," I replied. "And both times I've been the only one in the room who's seen what I've seen." She flinched. "We were talking about work, about life, about feeling seen." The last phrase left her lips like a confession written in pencil. I leaned forward. "And I don't see you?" It wasn't anger, more like a quiet plea from somewhere bone deep. Her eyes glossed over, but she didn't look away. "Not like you used to. Somewhere along the way, we stopped meeting in the same place." The words hit harder than any admission of infidelity could, because they weren't about betrayal, they were about absence. I swallowed against the dryness in my throat. "So what now?" She hesitated, her hands knotting the edge of her coat. "We end the in-between, one way or the other. Either we rebuild, or we let go before we start breaking each other in ways we can't fix." Outside, a car horn echoed down the street, a lonely sound between brick walls. I felt the plant's shadow stretch across the table, a reminder of care or neglect. It could go either way. "Do you want to rebuild?" I asked. It was the only question that mattered, and my voice carried the weight of both hope and dread. She reached across the table then, fingers brushing mine, tentative as if my hand might be the final test. "Yes, but only if you still do." For a moment I just sat there, feeling the tremor in her touch, seeing the exhaustion in her eyes that came from holding something heavy too long. "I do," I said finally, and it felt less like a wedding vow than a promise made in the rubble of something we'd both helped destroy. We stayed like that, hands resting together, the space between us closing not with passion, but with the quiet resolve of people who know how close they came to losing. The tea had gone cold, the plant still leaned toward the light, and outside the rain began again, soft this time, almost forgiving. In the weeks to come, maybe we'd make it. Maybe we wouldn't. But tonight we'd chosen to try, and that choice felt, for now, like enough. When she finally smiled, a small, tired thing, it was for me, and I realized I hadn't seen that in far too long. And for the first time in days, I believed we might find our way back to the same place again.